Good afternoon, I'm Doug St. Dennis, and welcome to the first event, well, the second event actually. We had a concert last night of the Coronado Island Film Festival. This is very special. This is a free workshop, open to the public. All you have to do is go in and get something we've started doing last year, very successful, as an outreach, educational outreach. You just go in, because school's in session, that's why you had to go in and get a visitor's pass. But what an honor to be introducing a true friend of Coronado Island Film Festival, Dean Cundey, and his wife, Tisha Calmetto, is sitting back there. They came here first, I think it was 2017, when Dean received our Hubble Award for cinematography, and we all just fell in love with each other, and Dean kept coming back. For our classic series, we showed two of his films. Well, first we showed Back to the Future, and Dean and Tisha came, and we had a big party afterwards, and there was a DeLorean out front, and it was sold out. And then we did Romancing the Stone, and Dean and Tisha came. You know, anything to come to Coronado, right? Right. And then they were back with us last year, and Dean did a workshop up at the Spreckles Center. And so today, there are a lot of film students. Who's a film student in here? Where are your film students? There they are. Oh, good. You're gonna, I mean, if this makes me want to go back and become a film student listening to Dean talk. Dean is, as one of my young filmmaker friends said, I'd love to come and hear it from the legend. He is a legend of cinematography in the business. And when you hear him tell about what he does and the science of filmmaking, and I think it was Carlos that said he was a legend, wasn't it? Yes. And I mean, he was nominated for the Academy Award for Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which I think you told us was your favorite film of all the ones you've done. Is it still? One of the favorites. Jurassic Park, he's a Steven Spielberg favorite person, and he can tell you more about that. And well, I'm gonna let Big Cat Manning. Big Cat is the film teacher here at school, and he just had a couple of things he had to say. So here you go, Big Cat.
Thank you, Doug. I am Big Cat. Around here I'm called Mr. Manning, or sometimes some other things that I see scratched on the walls of the restroom and caricatures of myself and so forth. But all seriousness, I'm very excited that we have Mr. Cundey here to share his knowledge and expertise with not just my own small but powerful strand of students down here, but also to the rest of COSA and to the rest of the community at large. So, without further ado, a gentleman who has forgotten more about filmmaking than I will ever know, which, sorry guys, I'm your teacher, so I guess that's not a great thing to admit. Mr. Dean Cundey.
Thank you very much for both of those introductions, some of which was true, I think. But I'm here at doing something I love doing, which is talking about cinematography, but filmmaking, and what it is I do, why I do it, a little bit of how I do it. And I'm hoping that it will be of interest to you. I'll go through my keynote here, just in case you have to spell my name on the police report or something. And perhaps I will refresh your memory by running this reel, which, oh, what the? to remind you of some of the things I've done. As with a lot of these little film clips, I will talk through them. So don't think that you're going to see the whole story or even anything that tells you what the story's about. I started off early with John Carpenter, and he was such a great visual filmmaker that he and I hit it off immediately. And so some of my great memories are working on some of these films. The idea being that he was one of the first directors I worked with who was interested in really using visuals and the camera to tell a story. And I'm hoping that that's what I can talk to you about today. How these films benefited from careful thought about visual storytelling. Just in case you want to hear something.
You Mad Dog 10.
Nobody calls me Mad Dog.
I worked then with Robert Zemeckis on 5 films, starting with Romance in the Stone, going through the Mexican Future. He was also a director, a director who was very interested in visual storytelling, using the camera. You know, that's, I think, one of the crucial skills for a director and cinematographer is understanding how to use the camera to tell the story, engage the audience. This is my first film with Robert Zemeckis. Film with Steven Spielberg. Oh, no, I keep forgetting. Another Bob Zemeckis film. Again, very visual. He was always reaching for the unusual and how to tell it in an unusual way. This doesn't happen in real life. Bringing the cartoon into the live world with the Flintstones and A.S.C. And then the opposite side, which is portraying reality, taking the audience on a reality journey. And then there's Adam Sandler.
You think it, but I mean.
And then, one that we'll look at another clip and talk about. But it was another great journey, and Spielberg is perhaps the best visual storyteller. So we'll talk a little bit about that.
Where's the dog?
adventures in filmmaking. I'm hoping everybody has seen most of those films. Is there anyone here who hasn't seen any of those films? Because I'll have to have you removed. Okay, that's good. But no, it's good because there's a frame of reference. If you've seen these movies as an audience, and then we talk a little bit about them as filmmakers, you'll see some of the thought process that goes into a lot of this. So, cinematography. It's an interesting word, cinema, which derives from the word cinema, and photography, which comes from the suffix photography, which means, of course, film or motion photography. Now, why is the cinematography a crucial part of a film? Well, 80% of how we perceive our world is visual, according to the scientists, techweenies. And it's an important thing to understand because as you go through your day, you walk around and get somewhere visually, but you also take in a lot of the world visually with reading, films, of course, and television, paintings, all kinds of things like that, which are basically stories. And besides just walking around the world, so much of our life is about stories. Starting back in the very earliest days, we have been visual creatures. The earliest cave people painted on the walls of caves their version or story of the world around them. We are fortunate that they were so intrigued because we have a glimpse into their history this far back. And so as man decided that stories were great, visuals were really important. So painting. Some of the earliest painting, most of it, is religious in nature. Mythology, the three graces. And what it did is it made possible for people who couldn't read to understand and pass on these stories. The Sistine Chapel ceiling, one of the great paintings and great storytelling images in the world, reminded people as they went into the chapel of all of the stories and all of the thoughts and ideas in their religious backgrounds. After a while, painters began to say, well, why does it have to be just about religion? Why can't this reflect the world that everybody has? So the Dutch, Rembrandt and Vermeer and a lot of others, began painting real-life moments with real-life light. How we see is light. If we didn't have light, we couldn't see. You know, you go into a dark room and what do you see? So they began telling these stories using images that people could relate to in real life. Even though they were sometimes allegorical, in this case, a young girl holding a skull, probably contemplating the meaning of life or perhaps death. Caravaggio painted with real light candles, a brighter candle than probably we've ever seen before. But it was all about capturing things that people saw around them, to reflect on them. Here we have the floor scrapers, Caillebotte, who was a French guy, who decided it didn't have to be an amazing allegorical religious painting, but he could just capture some everyday life and people could look at it and say, oh yeah, that's what life is all about. So, so early life was painting. They lit with paint. The blank canvas, there's nothing there. They paint on it, and it comes to life. We like to use the analogy in film that we paint with light. That is sort of the opposite. Our medium is film, of course, and it needs light. So we deliberately manipulate light in order to create the visual storytelling. Now, then there came this period when somebody said, well, why do we have to paint? Can't we invent some way to actually capture the image? And there's all kinds of stories about that. They say back to 1100, there were people who were experimenting with crystals that turned dark and in light, and various things like that. Using and building on that, eventually in the early 1800s, we began to find a way to actually capture images. Matthew Brady was famous as a photographer who captured in the 1860s things like George Washington here. Oh, sorry, I should have gone to high school, I guess. Famous for capturing Lincoln, capturing everyday moments in a tumultuous time in the U.S., the Civil War. And these photos show us the reality, but it also shows us the ability to capture this time. Somebody said, well, why do they have to be just still? Isn't there some way we can capture movement? So George Eastman on the left with the film and Thomas Edison on the right with the camera invented motion picture photography, or so he claims, Edison. He actually was the first guy to patent it, so he owned the idea, but there were a lot of other people who invented cinematography. Eastman's and Edison's idea was to create the ability to capture movement. So they were able to capture forever not just the images of the time, but the actual movement, the action, the life. And, there were such fascinating subjects as a train pulling into a station and a lady doing a bizarre dance. And as a result, they would be able to capture about a minute, maybe, of movement on on film. His dream and his idea was to be able to show this in a kinetoscope. You would look into that little thing in the top, there would be the image, and you could see fascinating things like a train pulling into a station, a lady doing a bizarre dance, people walking down the street, etc., etc. Sadly, they were all the things that you could see in real life. His dream was to have kinetoscope parlors where there would be a lot of these machines, and you go and put your nickel in, and you could watch the train pulling into the station. Then you could go to the next one and watch the lady dancing. And it looked to me like this would be a pretty great date night. You take your girl or guy, and you can watch a train pulling into a station. There were other people who were credited with inventing cinematography. And they are probably more accurately the ones who did. The Lumiere brothers in France, who developed a camera that was actually pretty neat. And they could also capture about a minute's worth of moving image. As the process developed, there became this whole idea that they would be using these cameras, and here are a whole bunch of developed, more sophisticated cameras, still all hand cranked, that would capture these images. And they started to say, why do they have to be just like a train pulling into a station? Why don't we capture stories? Because that's what people really want. They want to be told stories. So they had the idea that they would set up this camera and record what was the first concept of entertainment, which was theater, plays. Oh, here comes the high point of the story. Watch this now. And then, the punchline. But it gradually developed that they would move the camera closer, they would do a close-up of a guy. This shot scared a lot of people the first time they saw it. A big head shooting a gun at them. So, over the next 100 years from the beginning of that, the cinema and cinematography has become perhaps the greatest art form known to man. Now, I make that rather grandiose, distinction. But if you think about it, it involves every other art ever invented by man or used to express ideas. There's literature, of course, for the script. There's painting for the backgrounds. There's architecture. There's architecture. There's photography. Think of an art, and it's probably in a motion picture. Cinematography, the greatest art form in the motion picture, by my humble concept. But what exactly is it? Well, it is capturing the images on film of these stories. How is it done? Well, it's become quite a complex art form now, but essentially it involves a camera, some way to capture it, originally film, now digital. It involves light to do the painting. We set up the lights to create the illusion of darkness, scary, bright for comedy. It shows you the story, but it also tells you how you're supposed to feel if you do it properly. So, the craft of cinematography, as it's sometimes called, involves all of this technical stuff. There's a tremendous amount of science involved in what cinematographers do. Lenses and exposure and how much light comes out and a lot of, it's gotten even more complex. Computers, we have to understand computers, computer imagery, an awful lot of things like that. So manipulating all of this science, using it, is essential. It's what gets us the image. But it has to become second nature. We are not engineers, we are, in fact, artists. And we have to use all of this science. It's one of the only jobs in filmmaking that requires an awful lot of understanding of this science. Directors have to understand story and characters, but very little science. Well, almost anybody else is involved with a little bit of science, but most of the time creation of images or feelings. Cinematographers are unique in that there is so much science that is part of it. Oops. Well, this is bad news. Here's that science creeping up on me. Well, let's talk about music. I may need a moment. Talk amongst yourselves.
Jackson. Are you guys good with those things? Yeah. Maybe you should offer some help.
I've never seen this before. It's a first for all of us.
Eating all this done?
Oh, there was. I restarted it. And now it perfect. All right, thank you. No, I put it back in. So let's hope that it continues on. We'll see. Now, besides all of this stuff, science, and as I've alluded to before, it's really all in the service of visual storytelling. People go to see a story. We go to experience a story. We sit home in front of our TV in order to see a story. And it's all done with a lot of images that are created. Here are just a very quick a selection of images from a lot of films that are unique, that have all passed through the eye of the cinematographer, the skill of the cinematographer and the director. The images are selected to amaze us, to show us something we're not used to seeing, to establish mood and style. To fascinate us with the impossible, to show us drama in ways we've never seen it before, amazing images, a view of history, personal relationships, the old days, dramatic moments to establish a mood. Images that are designed to grab our attention and tell us something about that moment in the story. Unique. To set up music, famous musical, to show us romantic relationships, strange people, romantic moments. And all using the camera. Now, you think about it, we go into a large room with seats similar to this. We look at a white wall, a blank wall. There's nothing there. I hate to disillusion you in case you go into this room thinking you're actually participating. You're not. You're looking at the work of the cinematographer. And while you're there, you believe. You believe you're watching people, situations, and so forth. All because of what the director wants to do, what the writer has created, what the characters perform. But the only way you see it on this white wall is from the point of view of the cinematographer and all of the tools and the science and artistry that that is at our disposal. So, let's talk about the visual storytelling and some of the techniques that we use that you may not be aware of. Is that the end of our session?
No.
We still have 2.5 hours of... visual storytelling is it's something that we'll look at. We'll look at some techniques. What I'm going to do is show you some clips from some of my adventures. But I will talk through the ideas behind the visuals, why we selected a particular position for the camera, a particular size of lens, the lighting, and why it was chosen to do something. And once again, I'll talk through this and point out stuff. So if you think you're going to get to see the movie, I'm sorry. But it's crucial to think about these visual stories, especially if you are interested in film. Even as an observer interested in film, an audience member. But if you are, in fact, like these folks down here, interested in film from a more analytical potential for making it your life, it's important to watch film very, very carefully for the visuals, which is why I suggest very often to film students and people who are interested, watch a film, maybe one of your favorites, maybe not, but watch it with the sound turned off. Just watch the visuals. Don't get trapped by the story, the sound effects, the music, the dialogue. All of that stuff is things that we as cinematographers think as superfluous. And there are stories that the production designer, the guy who designs the set, thinks of actors as people who stand in front of his work and block it from view. Well, we have similar ideas about it. So we're going to talk about storytelling with the camera. I will analyze this and explain to you our thinking, why we chose particular things. Let's talk about one of the things you want to do is always keep the audience intrigued, reveal to them in a poignant way something they have to understand, or understand from the standpoint of the character. So here's a little clip from Back to the Future 3. The idea is that Marty has just arrived in 1885, and he's now walking down this train track on the way to somewhere. He's not quite sure. What he is going to find is that he's arrived at the Hill Valley of the past. Hill Valley, his town of 1885. But how do we do it in a way that tells the audience and that has them experience some of the emotion of this awe and wonder that Marty is experiencing? So I suggested to Bob Zemeckis that we do this shot that I happened to see in a Sergio Leone Western. I thought was particularly effective, so I talked him into it. I didn't tell him I stole the idea, but you have to steal from the best and then take credit. So here is Marty arriving at Hill Valley, how to get the audience to experience what he's experiencing. So he lands at this train station, he looks, a little double take, woo. Now the camera rises to tell us where we are, Hill Valley, the audience, and then a wipe to reveal this town that he has never seen like this before, nor have we. So we're now going to experience his arrival in this world. So we've got close-ups of him reacting. We have his point of view of unusual sights that he's never seen. As he experiences, so do we. In each case, the camera reveals something new, which is, of course, what it is to him, new. And the final reveal, the courthouse that figured so prominently in the first two stories. He sees it as we do for the first time. So, that was the use of the moving camera in a way that takes the audience on a journey, visual, but also an emotional journey, a reveal. Let's talk a little bit more about the moving camera, but also camera placement. Where do you put the camera in any particular shot that does or tells you something you want the audience to experience or feel? Knowing that Back to the Future 3 was predominantly a Western, one of the things Bob and I wanted to do was to take the journey with the audience into the Old West, but to do it with a little bit of a wink and a nod in the fact that most of us have not lived in the Old West. Is there anyone here who was 1885? No, I didn't think so. And so how have we experienced the Old West? Well, mostly through Westerns. And there's certain iconic images that we have, iconic feelings we have about the time period, the characters of the time, the events that happen. So the idea was to have a little fun with the Old West as we saw through Westerns. So what I'll talk to you about as we shoot through this is the idea we place the camera in very specific places to sort of recreate the emotional moments from Old Westerns. Very low angles for drama. Images that made the hero more heroic. Things that made the bad guy bad. So as we do that, we're going to look at a little opening sequence, which I will point out the moments that are in fact iconic of Westerns. And then we'll go into a little sequence right after that inside the barn, which is an exposition, as they call it. In other words, information that the filmmaker wants to tell the audience. And explained it not as two people talking back and forth, but how do you do it in a visual way so that the audience is drawn into listening to all of this story that we have to hear, information, but also experiencing something of what the characters are going through. And so the idea was to, in the barn, create a sequence that made the audience feel they were there. In other words, instead of like a lot of movies where it's cut, close up, wide shot, medium shot, close up, over the shoulder, cut. Your brain, each time it cuts, your brain takes a moment to say, where am I? Have I been here? Have I seen this before? Oh yes, or oh no, I want this. And it takes place in a fraction of a second. But you become aware of the technique. We wanted to do something where the camera was the audience. It was you standing and watching, maybe walking, turning your head as the character moved and so forth. So we'll look at two moments out of this one. First, we're going to look for iconic images as poor Marty gets dragged by the bad guy. A low angle move in to create the menace of the bad guy. Some chaotic moments. And then a very low angle shot with a lot of foreground, dirt in the foreground. Ah, look, somebody walks in, a mysterious figure. Who is it? With an amazing thing. Oh, Doc Brown. A low angle, which shows the town and him silhouetted against the sky. You'll notice that almost everything is a low angle below eye level of all of these characters, which creates the mood and the feeling that these people are somehow significant in their own way. So he's the bad guy, by the way. He's the hero. A very wide shot to show Marty small and insignificant in the side. Right, so pan with the horses to reveal rather than cutting. Doc.
Marty?
And then now we'll move with him. So we're walking along with him. A nice, pleasant hug and relationship shot. Now we're going to cut inside the barn. The barn itself was completely sealed in and dark. And I said, well, let's take advantage of some of this. So I had him remove a lot of boards from the ceiling. So now we've got these slashes of light that come through and tell you as the audience, where is the light coming from? So now we've got the first of 3 shots. The camera pulls back to include Doc all the time. Now we're going to pan with Doc. You as the audience are fascinated, so you're just turning your head to watch. Now we'll watch Doc. Now he's going to back up just a little bit to allow us to pan over and reveal the guy coming in the wagon. Same shot. This is from the point of view, kind of wide. You know, no need to go up close, you can hear him. The point of view of Marty, who is the second shot. Now we'll move in to accentuate Doc's reaction now. Back to the shot of Marty. We follow him over to Doc.
There we go, Claire is. Marty, it's impossible. The idea that I can fall in love at first sight.
So we, as the audience, are just standing there. Now Michael stays close behind Doc because he wants to stay in the frame. And now we're going to have him come up and accentuate one of his thoughts by moving up closer to the camera and facing it and saying something. And then Doc comes up and talks to him, and now they're on equal footing as they talk back and forth. Oh, something here. Now the camera moves up to reveal in a dramatic sort of way this Kotaku machine, which turns out to be an ice maker. Iced tea? Okay, so now the characters will stay close together, the camera will follow. Nice wide shot, shows Doc's living quarters. The camera moves up. Now they're confronted with a problem. No, this is all on a crane with a remote head. Now we're going to move in closer and closer. Pretty soon, we're going to move in past Marty to Doc, but we can see him in the mirror, so he's still in the scene. So, so now let's look at something else. Jurassic Park was a particularly interesting and rewarding experience for me. It is the very first time the computer has ever been used to create photorealistic creatures. Now, it's easy now to you look at films, there's so much CGI, computer-generated imagery, that we just accept it. And there was the comment the other day when I said Jurassic Park. Somebody said, oh yeah, that was one of those dinosaur movies. And I didn't want to correct him and say, no, you idiot. That was the dinosaur movie. It was the first time it had ever been done with a computer. So, one of my favorite scenes here is a great mixture of the techniques we used. some lighting, camera movement, but a combination of dinosaurs, raptors that were rubber, animatronic, actually puppets really, and computer generated. Now, I'm particularly pleased by this sequence because even now, as we look back on it, there are no artifacts that say, oh yeah, that's a phony dinosaur or whatever. They're so much better now. You can look back at this movie and it holds up so well because of the diligence of so many people who were dedicated to making this work. And it was my pleasure to work with Spielberg, but also to be part of creating this stuff for the first time. So let's look at one of my favorite sequences. The kids in the kitchen being chased by raptors. Now this is all about Spielberg also, with his touches. The kid, what's he looking at? The girl, and he said, shake the jello, you're nervous. And the jello amplifies her emotion. And then a silhouette against a painting. Now we move into the kitchen, a terrible place to shoot because everywhere was stainless steel, brushed stainless steel, that reflects every single light that you have. So we took a lot of time to hide the lights, hide reflections, hide the camera reflections, but that's what the production designer wanted, so you always give them their creative freedom. So here's a puppet. A classic Spielberg shot. Click the gun, tilts up to the character, and then pan over to reveal more characters. You'll notice you can see them all. So, once again, a puppet. Typically, the puppet was, it is the case when the dinosaur never moved, took steps, and was only half of the dinosaur. Pan to reveal the kids, the threat that's behind them, and now their emotions. Now, as soon as the dinosaur is full figure and moved, for instance here, this is computer generated. They did a great job in matching the lighting, the shadows, the perspective. One of the things I learned on Roger Rabbit was that if you want to get the audience to believe something that doesn't exist on the set or world, have them interact with that world. So I had them deliberately place a lot of pots and pans on top of this table, saying that they would be good if the dinosaurs interacted with them. Low angle broad shot. That makes you believe that there are creatures in that real world. CG dinosaurs once again. Interaction with the CG dinosaur. Classic composition. Now here was the first ever moving the camera on CG. Perspective changing, everything changing. It was amazing at the time. Now it's nothing. CG dinosaur. camera movement. And the composition tells you where you're supposed to be looking. Low angles. And the last moment. How are we doing for time? What time is, are we done? Huh?
We're at 3:03 right now.
Yeah, and how much time do I have to dribble on?
We could sit here and listen to you tell stories all day, but if people need to leave, we did say till 3 o'clock, but please continue if you have more.
Very well. I have one more clip, and then if there's any questions, I'd be delighted to take those. Here's another clip from one of my favorite movies, Roger Rabbit. Now, since I was a kid, I was interested in animation like 12 years old. So I learned everything I could. I read the books, I listened to all the Disney things, I watched Disney movies, and I understood how animation was done, you know, the techniques and so forth. And so when Bob Zemeckis said, hey, you want to make this goofy movie about animated characters in the real world, I said, of course I do. So we did. We went off to make the movie. And we developed techniques, once again, that hadn't been done in any of the movies that were a combination of live action and animation. They've been doing that since the very earliest days. Disney's first films were Alice in Cartoonland, where a real girl was in an animated world. And of course, Disney had made Pete's Dragon, and, you know, Mary Poppins, and an awful lot of films that involved animated and live action. But we wanted to do something different, so we broke all the rules that Disney had said. Don't move the camera. Block off the camera so the animators can work. And okay. Don't have the characters go in and out of light. That's too difficult to paint and animate. Okay. Don't ever move the camera with like a dolly or whatever, because that's impossible to do. Okay. And as soon as Bob and I left this meeting that we were having at Disney, that was about an hour of don't do, we walked out and we said to each other, well, these are the rules we're going to break. We're going to make up new rules. So we did. And it was surprising how the animators that were chosen, Richard Williams was a Canadian who was living in London making commercials, but he was making unique commercials with a moving camera and perspective and all kinds of interesting things. And we approached him, and after, you know, Disney animators had turned it down and stuff. And he said, yeah, I'd love to break the mold. So we went off on this journey. And every shot we created something new. We tried techniques that hadn't been done. We tried, you know, creating more illusion that these characters existed in this real world. And we were very fortunate when we finally cast Bob Hoskins as Eddie Valiant, the detective, that he was able to see Roger Rabbit on the set. In his mind, he could imagine Roger was there, even though he was looking at a yellow tennis ball a lot of the times. for where his eye position should be. He was able to act and emote to something that wasn't there. In his mind, he would imagine what was happening. And we had Roger Rabbit's voice on the set so we could hear the dialogue. And as a result, we ended up with something that, for the time was extraordinary. Since then, right afterwards, all of the things you shouldn't and couldn't do in animation started showing up in commercials for cereal and all kinds of stuff. People were no longer afraid to try something. And they would talk to people who had worked on Roger and say, well, how did you do this? And they could learn. So it was a great fun learning experience for me, but for an awful lot of people during the show and then afterwards. And now there's quite a bit of combining live action and animation. Even when you think it's real, in a lot of the superhero movies, there's a tremendous amount of animated combination. So let's look at a little sequence out of Roger. It's kind of a historical look, but I'll point out the techniques that we had sort of developed. One of them being, as much as possible, create interaction between the animated character and the real world. We would look for excuses throughout the movie. Roger would be blocked by a chair and move it aside. He could have just walked through, but we put the chair there, so he had to move it. And it was interesting because a lot of times the animators who were new would say, I don't get it, why does that chair move? And we would say, well, that's because Roger moves it as, oh, well, that's a cool idea. Oh, great. And they would get on board with all of that. So we're going to look at a sequence that has a lot of interaction. Some of it fairly tricky, splashing water that was water jets underneath the surface of the sink that you're going to be looking at. The weasels that figure prominently in this scene are carrying real weapons. Now they could carry very real-looking CG weapons, guns and stuff. In those days, you couldn't do that. So we had puppeteers with a wire to the gun who would then move it as if they were imagining what the weasel or the animated character would do. So it was a tremendously interesting give and take, constantly thinking of something new to do. So let's look at a little scene from Roger Rabbit, where the old style animation, it was old style, it wasn't done in the computer as it is now, it was pencil on paper, painting cells, clear acetate cells with the image of the cartoon character painted on the back and photographed and then composited using an old-fashioned optical printer before we could composite on computers. So this is, again, an interesting historical look at the beginning. And as a result, it's an interesting way to analyze what it is we did, but what one would want to do, and not just accept it as something you can do now in the contemporary world of computers. So, in this, the handcuff that's on Eddie's and Roger's wrist is in fact welded solid and is being manipulated by Eddie, by Bob Hoskins. He had to imagine not only the dialogue, but also the movement and where his hand was. Shadows, artificial animated shadows we put in.
That's all this wee stuff. It's just like a rabbit.
Because, of course, there were no weasels. very deliberately done. I put the light up there so that it would cast these shadows, as opposed to Disney saying, now be careful of shadows. Let's see, how about we have him move a chair to get over instead of just standing and talking. The shadow on Eddie's shirt. There's a whole bunch of trash that I put there.
Look, family, we got a reliable tip-off. The rabbit was here and was corrugated by several others. But that was...
You keep talking like that, and I'm gonna have to wash your mouth out.
Get the trash, be interactive again, throwing papers around, the soap, the machine gun, the window shades in the back. The rubber plunger. And the key to this was having this stuff manipulated actually by puppeteers. Puppeteers are guys who are really good at giving life to inanimate things, whether it's Muppets or objects, as opposed to a prop guy who would just hold it and splash in water. A special faucet that came up to spray the water and then drop down. Once again, Eddie moving the hand up.
For starters, ever kiss me again.
So, that was the adventure that was Roger Rabbit. And with that I say, thank you. So, I would say we should take a few questions, if you still have the patience. Yes, sir, you in the back there?
Am I correct that you plan every shot down to the second before you start shooting? And then on set, do things typically change, or do you typically plan so well that you pretty much follow your plan? How does that work for you?
Well, these films take an awful lot of the planning you talk about. We do storyboards. We every shot is drawn like a cartoon strip, so that you can try to imagine exactly what would happen for each and every shot. Sometimes there are very specific things that are put into those storyboards that reference picking up an object or something. But very often, you know, the guys who were doing the storyboards were used to doing animated cartoons or live action movies. None of them were really at first in tune with how do we do both. So on the set very often we would say, now let's do this, let's have them move the chair instead of having a box or something there already that the weasel could hop up on. Deliberately saying, oh, it's a perfect opportunity. The shot sees him come up the stairs, we put this chair there, he swings it around, and more interaction. So a lot of times we would do stuff on the set to invent. And that was one of the things that made it so much fun was deliberately trying to come up with these ideas, these techniques, and always, I think one of the key things that we went by was if these characters actually existed, how would you shoot the scene? Where would you put the camera? Would they walk and you pan the camera with them? As opposed to letting the rules dictate, you know, oh, well, we can't have this happen because that would be too much trouble. We would very deliberately break the rules and invent new techniques. And we were very fortunate in that the visual effects supervisor, who was in charge of compositing all of this stuff, and the animation director were both completely on board. Ken Ralston, who was the guy from ILM, George Lucas's company that did the compositing, he was a guy who we would say, you know, Ken, here's what we'd like to do, or here's what I'd like to do. The camera does this and the character that, and then this happens. And Ken would say, well, nobody's ever done that before. Let's give it a try. We'll shoot one safe one in case we can't do what you guys want to do. But it was surprising that almost 90-some% of the time, whatever we dreamed up, they found a way to do it. Challenging your colleagues, collaborators, with something that they have to work on instead of just doing something over again. They have to become a part of the process, and I think that's one of the key things that made it work so well, but also is something that should happen in all kinds of filmmaking. Yes, sir.
I'm curious what you think about where film is heading. Like when you described, you go, you're with other people, you don't know everyone, but you're watching and you're having a shared experience. And it seems to be shifting from that with all the streaming services, not entirely, but slowly, with all the streaming services and all these on-demand shows and everything's being put online. So I'm curious what you think about the shift in the sense of how people should watch.
Good. The question is, where is film going, essentially? Very interesting because if you look at old films, how many of you guys have watched Casablanca? Oh, am I ever impressed? I teach sometimes, like at a university in LA, and I've said, how many people have seen Casablanca, great old movie, no hands go up? And I'd say, oh, well, okay, what about Humphrey Bogart? What was one of his best movies? And they would say, Humphrey who? And I would say, how many have seen a black and white movie? And it's, oh, yeah, but it's always a black and white movie that was made like 2 years ago. I'd say, no, Turner Classic Movies, film from 1938. How many have ever, oh, no, I think they're boring. Well, no, they're the literature of where we've come from. The film techniques, the storytelling, the characters, everything that made this business become what it is 100 years later, comes out of that. And I'm always intrigued by the fact that, as you guys as high school students and anybody who typically paid attention in school had to read Mark Twain, Shakespeare, Dickens, people like that, to understand the literature of the written word. But film is the literature of today. There should be classes that you are required to attend that show old movies. Casablanca, Humphrey Bogart, Alfred Hitchcock, all of the people who made visual storytelling what it is. That's sadly sort of disappearing. The films of today, the superhero adventures, which are, in my estimation, mostly video games, because they want to dazzle you more than really move you with the characters. You were stuck with paying attention to the characters in those old movies and caring about them, or not caring if it wasn't a successful movie, but for the most part, you had to care about the people. And now, with the computer, you know, that very often it's like dazzling you with some new fabulous thing. And so I'm, you know, a little dismayed that, you know, there's so much of that, and people are being fed that, and we become used to that, and if it doesn't happen, you know, it's sort of like a boring movie. But where is it going? Well, we have streaming now so much. You have the ability to watch almost any movie you want on your computer, at home, on your TV. You know, the shift is going away from you know, making movies only for the theaters, like it used to be, to, well, will this stream well? Is there an audience out there for, you know, this is a big, giant movie that people are going to watch on their phone. You know, it's like too bad, sad. So how do you accommodate that audience? Well, unfortunately, a lot of people are saying, well, my iPad or my computer is almost like a game, so I'll watch, you know, stuff blow up and collapse and guys fly. And it's you know, it's a little distracting because you know, you don't have the ability to get as involved with the audience. You know, I somehow imagine that a lot of the CGI guys who have learned this most of the time by themselves on their own computers. These are guys who, well, they probably live in their mother's basement, and they have computers, and they say, oh, you know what else would be cool? And they do something because they can, without necessarily understanding, you know, the story or whatever. So we're getting divorced from real storytellers a lot of times. So you have to be cautious, I think, about that kind of stuff if you consider it as part of our current literature of film. It's the comic books of film, or as opposed to the literature. Yes, the young lady in the back.
Hi. One is an observation and one is a question. Thank you so much for your body of work. I can't tell you how many times I've seen Who Framed Roger Rabbit. I adore this film, but along with certain sequences in Reservoir Dogs and Taxi Driver, I still cannot watch the scene when Judge Doom kills that poor little shoe.
Oh, yes, when he kills that shoe.
And to this day, I cannot watch it.
Well,
It's a great film.
You know what was interesting about that, just as an aside, when that first was shown as part of the trailer and also to regular folks watching it, they said, oh my God, he killed it, he dipped that poor shoe.
Yes!
Now, you know, I hate to disillusion you, but the shoe doesn't really exist. It's just a bunch of paint on a cell. But to me, what was significant, and is significant about that, is that you got involved in the emotion. It made you feel something, which is something that we try to do in film. You know, how do you get the audience to go through these emotions, to get them completely sucked into believing and feeling and so forth. So I think that's a very apt kind of observation, in that something that we know doesn't exist can move us, you know, to some emotional reaction. But you had a question also.
It's actually about Apollo 13. The filming of the sequences in which they are without gravity. How did you do it?
Well, the problem is if I tell you. It's an interesting story. I don't know how much of the real story you want to hear, but we were concerned with the weightless stuff during pre-production. And Ron said, how are we going to do this? And we tried stuff like putting guys on wires in front of a blue screen, shooting with the camera upside down and hanging them, and so the wires went out of the bottom of the frame and you weren't looking for them at the top, and all kinds of things. None of them looked real. There were always artifacts. Hair would hang and, react to gravity and all. So one day Ron and Tom Hanks and Gary Sinise and they all went down to Houston, and all of the director and all of the, as they began to call them, the astronauts, but they went to Houston, went through this orientation program that NASA has, and it showed them, techniques and what it's like to wear a suit and all of that. And one of the events was a ride on the KC-135 aircraft, the Vomit Comet, as it's called. Essentially, it's an airplane that has been restructured for strength and with bigger engines, but has no seats on the inside. The fuselage is completely empty and it's padded. And the airplane, you get in the airplane, it goes up to about 36,000 feet and comes over the top of a parabola and dives to Earth. And as it's diving to Earth, you are falling to Earth. But they keep the aircraft centered around you. And as a result, with reference to the inside of the aircraft, you are weightless. And there's no wind blowing, so it's sort of like you're weightless. And Ron came back from the trip with video, and he said, come here. And we went to his office, and he showed the video of these guys. They would be sitting on the floor, and then they would levitate. Then they would turn and rotate, and they would push each other, and they'd float, and they were weightless. He said, this is how we do it. So, Ron calls up NASA and says, we'd love to be able to shoot. We'll bring the set to the, and they said, oh, wait. What do you mean, shoot in the air? No. You don't understand. We do that, but you signed the waiver. And well, frankly, suppose something went wrong and we killed Tom Hanks. And Ron said, oh, well, no, we'll sign waivers. And no, I'm sorry, impossible. Ron was very dismayed. He said, wait, you know what, I'm going to call my state senator and have him say this is an official thing, a great heroic American story, the space program, blah, blah, blah. And these guys want to do something that's never, ever been done, show real weightless. And the senator said, whoa, that sounds great, I'll call NASA right now. He calls back and says, NASA says, what if we killed Tom Hanks? No, you can't do it. And so Ron is thinking now, I've got to go to somebody more powerful than the state senator. Who can that be? I know. So he calls up Steven Spielberg. And Steven calls up one of his friends, Bill Clinton, the president at the time. And Bill says, oh, that sounds like a pretty good thing, an American heroic story, blah, blah, blah. So he calls up NASA. The next day, NASA calls up and says, you know, we've been thinking about this over a little bit. Maybe we can work something out. So I had them modify the set so it would fit inside the fuselage of the plane and made it just a little shorter here and whatever. Pre-lit it. They took it down, loaded it into the aircraft, and they shot for 6 days all of the weightless stuff. And it was amazing. We looked at the dailies, totally believable because, of course, it was. Now, there's only 23 seconds of weightless each time. So in that case, you know, it was designed with specific shots that were no longer than